Welcome back to Major Intonio's presentation of The Reality of War, A Companion to Clausewitz, by Stewart L. Murray. Chapter 9. Strategy.
Clausewitz defines strategy as the use of the battle to gain the object of the war. War is a chain of battles all strung together, one of which always brings on another. The great thing in strategy is to win these battles one after the other till the enemy submits. The best strategy is always to be very strong, first generally, secondly, at the decisive point. In such an aspect, we grant that the superiority of numbers is the most important factor in the result of a battle. Only it must be sufficiently great to be a counterpoise to all the other cooperating circumstances. The direct result of all this is that the greatest possible number of troops should be brought into action at the decisive point. Whether the troops thus brought up are sufficient or not, we have then done in this respect all that our means allowed. This is the first great principle of strategy, as well suited for Greeks or Persians, or for Englishmen or Marathas, as for French or Germans. It sounds so simple, and yet how many times has it not been done? How many generals have been ruined in consequence? Superiority in numbers. What is required for strategic certainty? Clausewitz says, "It is a fact that we may search modern military history in vain for a battle, except Leuthen or Rosbach, in which an army has beaten another double its own strength, an occurrence by no means uncommon in former times. Bonaparte, the greatest general of modern days, in all his great victorious battles, with one exception, that of Dresden 1813, had managed to assemble an army superior in numbers, or at least very little inferior, to that of his opponent, and when it was impossible for him to do so, as at Leipzig, Brienne, Laon, Waterloo, he was beaten." From this we may infer, in the present state of Europe, that it is very difficult for the most talented general to gain a victory over an enemy double his strength. Now, if we see that double numbers are such a weight in the scale against even the greatest generals, we may be sure that in ordinary cases, in small as well as in great combats, an important superiority of numbers, but which need not be over 2-1, will be sufficient to ensure the victory, however disadvantageous other circumstances may be. The double superiority of numbers at the decisive point is, therefore, the ideal of strategy. The superiority of numbers is, therefore, to be regarded as the fundamental idea, always to be aimed at, before all, and as far as possible. If strategy has done this, then it has done its utmost duty. It is then for the tactician to make the most of this superiority, thus provided by strategy, and win the victory. Strategy then repeats the operation with new combinations suited to the altered circumstances to win the next battle, and so on, till the hostile armed force is destroyed. This superiority of numbers in battle as the first principle of strategy we require, on all occasions in season and out of season, to repeat and repeat. At present, we have not the numbers we shall want. We must get them. Otherwise, we are bound to be inferior in numbers, and the best strategy will be possible for our enemies and impossible for us. This rests with our statesmen. The decisive point. If the double superiority, or as near the double as possible, at the decisive point is the ideal of strategy, what is the decisive point? Here we owe another debt to Clausewitz. Jomini, even after Napoleon, confuses us with 3 different sorts of decisive points in a theater of war, but Clausewitz clears the air by asserting only one. But whatever may be the central point of the enemy's power against which we are to direct our ultimate operations, still the conquest and destruction of his army is the surest commencement and in all cases the most essential. Here we have it in a nutshell. Wherever the enemy's main force is, there is the decisive point against which we must concentrate all our forces. "There are," said Napoleon, "many good generals in Europe, but they see too many things at one time. As for me, I see only one thing, the enemy's chief army, and I concentrate all my efforts to destroy it." The simultaneous use of all the forces. The rule, says Clausewitz, which we have been endeavoring to set forth is therefore that all the forces which are available and destined for a strategic object should be simultaneously applied to it, and this application will be all the more complete the more everything is compressed into one act and one moment. This he calls the law of the simultaneous employment of the forces in strategy. In strategy, we can never employ too many forces. What can be looked upon in tactics as an excess of force must be regarded in strategy as a means of giving expansion to success. No troops should be kept back as a strategic reserve, but every available man hurried up to the first battlefield, fresh levies being meanwhile formed in rear. As an instance of what not to do, Prussia in 1806 kept back 45,000 men in Brandenburg and East Prussia. They might, if present at Jena, have turned defeat into victory, but they were useless afterwards. A fault so often made may be made again. Concentration. It is impossible to be too strong at the decisive point, said Napoleon. To concentrate every available man and gun at the decisive point so as to attain superiority there is not an easy thing, for the enemy will be making a similar attempt. The calculation of time and space appears the most essential thing to this end. But the calculation of time and space, though it lies universally at the foundation of strategy and is to a certain extent its daily bread, is still neither the most difficult nor the most decisive one. Much more frequently, the relative superiority, that is, the skillful assemblage of superior forces at the decisive point, has its foundation in the right appreciation of those points, in the judicious distribution which by that means has been given to the forces from the very first, and in the resolution to sacrifice the unimportant to the advantage of the important. In this respect, Frederick the Great and Bonaparte are especially characteristic. There is no simpler and more imperative rule for strategy than to keep all the forces concentrated, no portion to be separated from the main body unless called away by some urgent necessity. On this maxim we stand firm and look upon it as a fact to be depended upon. The concentration of the whole force, i.e., within supporting distance, should be the rule, and every separation or division is an exception which must be justified. Of course, this does not mean that all the troops are to be kept concentrated in one mass upon one road, but within supporting distance, for he expressly states, "It is sufficient now if the concentration takes place during the course of the action." This doctrine, qualified by the last sentence, makes Clausewitz the germ of modern military thought, for the last sentence leaves room for all the modern developments of new roads, railways, telegraphs, wire and wireless, and so forth. Therefore, in war, according to Clausewitz, concentration, 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 and every division or detachment is an evil which can only be justified by urgent necessity. Here again we find a simple truth, which, however, the history of all wars shows us to be very difficult to carry out. Hence the value of keeping such an imperative maxim always in our minds. The first pitched battle. The more a general takes the field in the true spirit of war, as well as of every other contest, that he must and will conquer, the more will he strive to throw every weight into the scale in the first battle, and hope and strive to win everything by it. Napoleon hardly ever entered upon a war without thinking of conquering his enemy at once in the first battle. At the very outset of war, we must direct all our efforts to gain the first battle, because an unfavorable issue is always a disadvantage to which no one would willingly expose himself, and also because the first decision, though not the only one, still will have the more influence on subsequent events the greater it is in itself. The law of the simultaneous use of the forces in strategy lets the principal result, which need not be the final one, take place almost always at the commencement of the great act. A great victory thus won at the outset will upset all the enemy's plan of campaign and allow us to carry out our own. The first pitched battle is therefore the crisis of the rival strategies, and towards its favorable decision all our preparations, all our forces, and all our energies should be directed. This is a point that civilians seem to find hard to grasp. Witness all our history, with inadequate forces at the beginning of every war, as even in the latest of our wars, that in South Africa. It is a point which our statesmen should very seriously consider. The difficulty of concentrating superior numbers for the first battle is that the enemy will be, or should be, of the same opinion, and will be making equal efforts to win the first battle. So then, the crisis will be all the more acute, the battle greater, and the result greater. We would not avoid showing at once that the bloody solution of the crisis, the effort for the destruction of the enemy's main force, is the firstborn son of war. Till this is done, the first great victory gained, strategy should think of nothing else. Then, and only then, a further combination in accordance with the altered circumstances to win the next. For we maintain that, with few exceptions, the victory at the decisive point will carry with it the decision on all minor points, over the whole theater of war. Therefore, nothing else matters for long, and to victory in the first great battle everything else must be sacrificed, for concentration can only be obtained by sacrifice. Pursuit. Once the great victory is gained, the next question is not about rest, not about taking breath, not about reorganizing, etc., but only of pursuit, of fresh blows wherever necessary, of the capture of the enemy's capital, of the attack of the armies of his allies, or whatever else appears as a rallying point for the enemy. Clausewitz points out that this is very difficult, and that to compel his exhausted troops vigorously to pursue till nightfall requires great force of will on the part of the equally exhausted commander. We need only remember that Napoleon himself, at the supreme crisis of his fate, being physically tired, failed to pursue the Allies after his victory at Dresden, 1813, whereby he lost all the fruits of his victory, and indeed his last chance of ultimate success. Summary of strategic principles. Leaving out, for the sake of shortness, the rest of his strategical thoughts, I hasten to conclude this sketch with a glance at Clausewitz's admirable summary of strategic principles. The first and most important maxim which we can set before ourselves is to employ all the forces which we can make available with the utmost energy. Even if the result is tolerably certain in itself, it is extremely unwise not to make it perfectly certain. The second principle is to concentrate our forces as much as possible at the point where the decisive blow is to be struck. The success at that point will compensate for all defeats at secondary points. The third principle is not to lose time. Rapidity and surprise are the most powerful elements of victory. Lastly, the fourth principle is to follow up the success we gain with the utmost energy. The pursuit of the enemy when defeated is the only means of gathering up the fruits of victory. The first of these principles is the foundation of all the others. If we have followed the first principle, we can venture any length with regard to the three others without risking our all. It gives the means of continually creating new forces behind us, and with new forces every disaster may be repaired. In this, and not in going forward with timid steps, lies that prudence which may be called wise. These great principles are everything in war, and due regard being paid to these principles, the form, i.e. the geometrical element in which the operations are carried on, is in the end of little consequence. Therefore I am perfectly convinced that whoever calls forth all his powers to appear incessantly with new masses, whoever adopts every imaginable means of preparation, whoever concentrates his force at the decisive point, whoever thus armed pursues a great object with resolution and energy, has done all that can be done in a general way for the strategical conduct of the war, and that, unless he is altogether unfortunate in battle, will undoubtedly be victorious in the same measure that his adversary has fallen short of this exertion and energy. Reflections. When we have got these great simple leading principles of strategy firmly into our heads, the next question is how to make use of our knowledge. For principles are no use unless we apply them. On consideration, it appears that there are three ways in which we can all apply these principles with advantage. 1. It will prove a very interesting and strengthening mental exercise to apply these few leading principles to every campaign we read about, to search for indications of their application in the strategy of each belligerent, how far each commander succeeded, and how far failed to carry them out in their entirety, and where, when, and why he succeeded or failed, and the results of doing or not doing so. Also to search for the interaction of the political motive of the war on the military operations, and to see how far the belligerent statesmen gained or failed to gain their political object, according to the comparative degree of preparation they had made for it, and the magnitude of effort which they made or did not make to support it with the whole means of the nation, material, moral, and physical. Also to see how far the national spirit was aroused or not, and the causes thereof, and to note the greater or less energy, resolution, and boldness which was consequently infused into the war. Also to note how the thorough application of these great simple principles of strategy shortens the war and thereby reduces its cost, 1866 to 1870, and how the neglect of them by statesmen, despite their fortitude afterwards, lengthens a war and adds to its cost enormously, South Africa, etc. Used thus, these principles give us a theoretically correct ground for criticism. 2. These principles also give us a theoretically correct ground for anticipating what the action of our opponents in any future war will be, the measure of the forces they will bring to bear, how they will direct those forces, and the amount of energy, resolution, and boldness with which they will use them against us. It is an axiom always to assume that the enemy will do the best and wisest thing, and to prepare accordingly. 3. These principles also give us a theoretically correct ground for our own counter-preparations. We require to take the most dangerous war which is probable or possible, and make every imaginable preparation to carry out these principles therein. In such a case, how are we going to render it possible for our generals to win, and thus save the nation from the irreparable consequences and the huge war indemnity of £800 million or so, which would follow defeat? How are we going to do it? How are we going to render it possible for our generals to employ the best strategy? The ideal of strategy always to be aimed at is the double superiority of numbers. How are we going to give our generals that? If we cannot do that, how are we going to give them even any superiority at all, so that they may be able to carry out the first principle of strategy? How? Or are we going to make no adequate preparations for these three eventualities, and when one of them suddenly comes, ask our generals to save us from the fate we have brought upon ourselves by performing the impossible? It is in this way that a statesman should use these few great simple principles of strategy in order to attain his political object and safeguard the interests of the nation.
Chapter 10. The Execution of Strategy.
Now, as Clausewitz teaches it, the theory of war is easy enough to understand. There is no reason, one might almost say no excuse, why every one, soldier or statesman, should not know it fairly well. The great leading principles of strategy are few and simple. There is no reason why every one, soldier and statesman, should not understand and know these few simple principles thoroughly, and have them at his finger ends ready to apply them to the consideration of any military question, past, present, or future. So far all is easy. But when it is a question of carrying out in actual war this easy theory, these simple strategical principles, then it is quite a different matter. Then it is a matter of the very greatest difficulty. This is a difference which the mind always finds very hard to grasp, as witness the denunciations with which any failure in execution by a general, no matter how great the real difficulties with which he had to contend, is nearly always greeted. Observers rarely make allowances for these difficulties, very largely probably because they do not understand them. The present chapter is devoted to these difficulties of execution in war. The Genius for War. In Clausewitz's great chapter on the Genius for War, he sets forth the difficulties which confront a general, the character and genius, the driving and animating force required to overcome the friction of war. It is impossible to abstract it adequately. I can only advise all to read it for themselves, but I will endeavor to give an idea of it. After discussing the various sorts of courage required by a general, physical before danger and moral before responsibility, the strength of body and mind, the personal pride, the patriotism, the enthusiasm, etc., he comes to the unexpected. War, he says, is the province of uncertainty. 3/4 of those things upon which action in war must be calculated are hidden more or less in the clouds of great uncertainty. Here, then, above all other, a fine and penetrating mind is called for, to grope out the truth by the tact of its judgment. Mark this point, that 3/4 of the things that we as critics after the event know, when all information of the situation has been collected and published, were unknown to the general who had to decide, or only dimly guessed at from a number of contradictory reports. From this uncertainty of all intelligence and suppositions, this continual interposition of chance. Now, if he is to get safely through this perpetual conflict with the unexpected, two qualities are indispensable. In the first place, an understanding which, even in the midst of this intense obscurity, is not without some traces of inner light, which lead to the truth, and then the courage to follow this faint light. The first is expressed by the French phrase coup d'œil. The second is resolution. Resolution is an act of courage in face of responsibility. The forerunner of resolution is an act of the mind, making plain the necessity of venturing and thus influencing the will. This quite peculiar direction of the mind, which conquers every other fear in man by the fear of wavering or doubting, is what makes up resolution in strong minds. The vital importance of firmness and resolution, so strongly urged by Clausewitz, will be apparent to all if we reflect how even the strongest characters have been ruined by a temporary fit of vacillation in war. Compare, for instance, York von Wartenberg's masterly exposition of Napoleon's ruinous, suicidal vacillation in 1813 at Dresden. Also, there is required the power of listening to reason in the midst of the most intense excitement, in the storm of the most violent passions. But to keep to the result of bygone reflections in opposition to the stream of opinions and phenomena which the present brings with it is just the difficulty. Here nothing else can help us but an imperative maxim which, independent of reflection, at once controls it. That maxim is, in all doubtful cases, to adhere to the first opinion, and not to give it up till a clear conviction forces us to do so. But as soon as difficulties arise, and that must always happen when great results are at stake, then the machine, the army itself, begins to offer a sort of passive resistance, and to overcome this the commander must have great force of will, driving power, such as Napoleon's, and also the heart-rending sight of the bloody sacrifice which the commander has to contend with in himself. These are the weights which the courage and intelligent faculties of the commander have to contend with and overcome if he is to make his name illustrious, if he is to prevent the downfall of his country. Reflections. 1. In connection with these difficulties, I would like to put forward a suggestion as to criticism of a general's action in war, which, though not exactly Clausewitz's, is a corollary from Clausewitz. It is this. In reading a war with the clearness and after-knowledge of history, nearly all defeats are easily seen to be due to the non-observance of one or other of the few leading principles of strategy referred to in the previous chapter. But we must assume that the defeated general was familiar with that principle, and that his will was to carry it out. What then were the difficulties, the friction, which, on any particular day or days, overcame his will and made him sacrifice the principle? This is where most critics fail us. Here seems the matter to search for. And could a stronger resolution have enabled him to overcome those difficulties, that friction? And if so, how and by what means? But we must first discover the difficulties and uncertainties of the particular day when his will gave way. Take the Manchurian campaign as an instance. If we could only have a military history of the campaign of 1870 or that of Manchuria, written in the form of a series of appreciations of the situation, so that we know nothing but what the general knew at the time as we read, and if the true state of affairs could be withheld from us till the end, this, I think, would be very instructive and helpful. It would be a more difficult way of writing a military history, but I think that the extra trouble would be repaid by the extra value. So at least it appears. 2. If we reflect upon the enormous difficulties, so strikingly brought out by Clausewitz, which our generals have to contend with and overcome in actual war, it should surely teach us to curb our criticism. It should surely also make us resolve in future to try to aid them as far as is in our power at home, and not thoughtlessly to increase their already stupendous burdens. In the past, we at home have much to accuse ourselves of, much to regret. In the past, often have we added to the difficulties of our generals. Often have we greatly weakened their chances and increased those of their opponents. Often have we, unintentionally, through ignorance, cast a weight into the scale against our country. 3. The ignorance of the public regarding the conduct of war constitutes for us a very serious national danger. If this ignorance were less pronounced, If our statesmen understood the vast importance of information to the enemy, and the equal importance to our generals that this information the enemy should not obtain, then the public craving for information regarding every detail of what occurs in the field, and the demand for the wide publication thereof, would certainly be repressed. Nothing occurs in any of our campaigns which is not immediately made known. Reports of actions with the fullest details as to the troops engaged and the casualties that have befallen them appear in the columns of the press within a few hours of their occurrence. Any efforts, therefore, of our generals in the field to maintain secrecy as to strength, intentions, and movements are deliberately, though probably unintentionally, counteracted by their own countrymen. This is due to pure ignorance of war, no doubt, but the effect of this ignorance is as bad as if it were due to evil intention. In fairness, however, we must admit that, in the past, the immense value of reticence has not been fully appreciated by some of our soldiers themselves, and it were well if, in the future, more attention were directed to the importance of secrecy. The results of such almost criminal stupidity may not be apparent when we are fighting with a savage foe, but if we ever have, as we undoubtedly someday shall have, the misfortune to find ourselves engaged with a civilized power, we may be certain that not only will the operations be indefinitely prolonged and their cost enormously increased, but their successful issue will be for us highly problematical. In this connection, it must be remembered that every great power has secret agents in every country, including Great Britain, and that it will be easy for such a secret agent to telegraph in cipher or in some agreed code to an agent in a neutral state all war information published here, who will telegraph it on at once to the hostile general, who will thus get, within a very short time of its publication in London, perhaps just exactly the information he requires to clear up the strategical or tactical situation for him, and enable him to defeat the combinations of our generals. As a case in point, take Macmon's march on Sedan to relieve Metz in 1870, where secrecy was absolutely necessary for success, but which became known to the Germans by the English newspapers. Result, Sedan. That this cannot be allowed is plain. It is believed that the patriotism of our press will welcome any necessary measure to this end if it is made compulsory upon all.
Chapter 11. Tactics.
Some will probably feel inclined to ask what Clausewitz, who wrote more than 80 years ago, can possibly have to say about tactics which can be valuable in the 20th century. It was said by Napoleon that tactics change every 10 years, according, of course, to the progress of technicalities, etc. Weapons indeed change, but there is one thing that never changes, and that is human nature. The most important thing in tactics, the man behind the gun, never alters. In his heart and feelings, his strength and weakness, he is always much the same. Therefore, Clausewitz's tactical deductions, founded on the immense and varied data supplied by the desperate and long-continued fighting of the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, permeated as they are by his all-pervading psychological or moral view, can never lose their value to us. It is true, no doubt, that our rifles of today can be used with effect at a distance 10 times as great as the old smooth bores of Clausewitz's day, our shrapnel 5 times as far as his cannon, and that cover and ground play a far more important part now than then, and so on. All these things, of course, considerably modify the tactics of Clausewitz. Not so much, however, as some textbooks would lead us to suppose, which always seem to assume clear ground and clear weather. For after all, how many combats are fought on ground where there is a very restricted field of fire, vide Herbert's Defense of Plevna, etc., or at night? How many battles are fought during rain, or snow, or mist, or fog, which destroys all long range? Compare the tremendous fighting with bullets, bayonets, swords, hand grenades, and even fists of Nogi's attempt to cut the Russian line of retreat at Mukden, with the hand-to-hand fighting of Eylau, Friedland, Borodino, or with the desperate efforts of the French in 1812 to open their line of retreat through Maro-Jaroslavets, where all day the masses of troops fought hand-to-hand in the streets. The town was taken and retaken 7 times, and the rival nations fought with the bayonet in the midst of the burning houses. Allison. When it comes to push of pike, as in all great decisions between equally resolute adversaries, it is bound to do. The difference between the fighting of Clausewitz's day and ours is but small. The most recent instances of all, the hand-to-hand fighting in Manchuria, take us back to the Napoleonic struggles. Therefore, despite the 80 years that have intervened, the writings of Clausewitz are still valuable from a tactical point of view, always considering, of course, the difference in weapons because of the human heart in battle. His ideas on tactics have largely filtered through his German pupils into our textbooks, minus the psychological or moral note, so that it is not necessary to go at length into the subject or give a number of extracts. It would be wearisome. I will, however, give a few passages at haphazard as illustrations. Flank attacks. The endeavor to gain the enemy's line of retreat and protect our own, on which so much learned erudition has been spent by various writers, he regards as a natural instinct, which will always produce itself both in generals and subalterns. From this arises, in the whole conduct of war, and especially in great and small combats, a perfect instinct, which is the security of our own line of retreat and the seizure of the enemy's. This follows from the conception of victory, which, as we have seen, is something beyond mere slaughter. In this effort we see, therefore, the first immediate purpose in the combat, and one which is quite universal. No combat is imaginable in which this effort, either in its double or single form, is not to go hand in hand with the plain and simple stroke of force. Even the smallest troop will not throw itself upon the enemy without thinking of its line of retreat, and in most cases it will have an eye upon that of the enemy. This is a great natural law of the combat, and so becomes the pivot upon which all strategical and tactical maneuvers turn. Reserve's destructive and decisive act, the combat he regards as settled by whoever has the preponderance of moral force at the end, that is, in fresh or only partly used up troops. The combat itself he divides into a destructive and a decisive act. During the long destructive act, or period of fire preparation, the troops engaged gradually wear each other out, and gradually almost cease to count as factors in the decision. After a fire combat of some hours' duration, in which a body of troops has suffered severe losses, for instance, a quarter or one-third of its numbers, the debris may for the time be looked upon as a heap of cinders. For the men are physically exhausted, they have spent their ammunition, many have left the field with the wounded, though not themselves wounded. Compare, for instance, Eylau and the 1870 battles. The rest think they have done their part for the day, and if they get beyond the sphere of danger, do not willingly return to it. The feeling of courage with which they originally started has had the edge taken off. The longing for the fight is satisfied. The original organization is partly destroyed, and the formations broken up, so that the amount of moral force lost may be estimated by the amount of the reserves used up, almost as with a foot rule. This goes on till, in all probability, only the untouched reserve and some troops which, though they have been in action, have suffered very little, are in reality to be regarded as serviceable, and the remainder, perhaps 4/6, may be looked upon for the present as a caput mortuum. Therefore the art of the commander he regards as economy of force during the destructive period, that is, to employ as few troops as possible, by taking advantage of ground, cover, etc., to use a smaller number of men in the combat with firearms than the enemy employs, so that a smaller proportionate number of his own are reduced to a heap of cinders, and more are left, more moral force, for the decision. Hundreds of times, he says, a line of fire has maintained its own against one twice its strength, e.g. the Boers. To do this and yet obtain a good fire effect demands very skillful handling of the troops, both on the part of the chief and subordinate leaders. With the preponderance thus obtained, the commander at last starts the decision. Towards the close of a battle, the line of retreat is always regarded with increased jealousy. Therefore, a threat against that line is always a potent means of bringing on the decision, Liaoyang, Mukden. On that account, when circumstances permit, the plan of battle will be aimed at that point from the very first. Or, if this wear and tear and exhaustion of the forces has reached a certain pitch, then a rapid advance in concentrated masses on one side against the line of battle of the other, i.e., the Napoleonic breaking the center, of recent years thought almost hopeless, but revived in Manchuria with success, in the case of Nadzu breaking the center at Mukden. From what precedes, it is evident that, as in the preparatory acts, the utmost economy of forces must prevail, so in the decisive act to win the mastery through numbers must be the ruling idea. Just as in the preparatory acts, endurance, firmness, and coolness are the first qualities, so in the decisive act, boldness and fiery spirit must predominate. The difference between these two acts will never be completely lost as respects the whole. This is the way in which our view is to be understood. Then, on the one hand, it will not come short of the reality, and on the other, it will direct the attention of the leader of a combat, be it great or small, partial or general, to giving each of the two acts of activity its due share, so that there may be neither precipitation nor negligence. Precipitation there will be if space and time are not allowed for the destructive act. Negligence in general there will be if a complete decision does not take place, either from want of moral courage or from a wrong view of the situation. Duration of the combat. Even the resistance of an ordinary division of 8,000 or 10,000 men of all arms, even if opposed to an enemy considerably superior in numbers, will last several hours if the advantages of country are not too preponderating. And if the enemy is only a little or not at all superior in numbers, the combat will last half a day. A corps of 3 or 4 divisions will prolong it to double that time, an army of 80,000 or 100,000 men to 3 or 4 times. These calculations are the result of experience. As General von Kemmerer points out, if these calculations were adhered to in present-day German maneuvers, as they are now in all war games, tactical exercises, and staff rides, the dangerous dualism of their training, the difference between theory and maneuver practice, would cease. Attack and defense. I have left to the last the consideration of 3 or 4 disputed points in Clausewitz. In considering these, I shall quote a good deal from General von Kemmerer's Development of Strategical Science, as in such matters it is best to quote the most recent authors of established reputation. The most important of these, and the most disputed, is Clausewitz's famous dictum that the defensive is the stronger form of making war. The defense is the stronger form of war with a negative object. The attack is the weaker form with a positive object. General von Kemmerer says, "It is strange, we Germans look upon Clausewitz as indisputably the deepest and acutest thinker upon the subject of war. The beneficial effect of his intellectual labors is universally recognized and highly appreciated, but the more or less keen opposition against this sentence never ceases. And yet that sentence can as little be cut out of his work on war as the heart out of a man." Our most distinguished and prominent military writers are here at variance with Clausewitz. Now, of course, I do not here propose to go into such a controversy. I only wish to point out that Clausewitz, in saying this, only meant the defensive offensive, the form in which he always regards it, both strategically and technically, in oft-repeated explanations all through his works. For instance, it is a first maxim never to remain perfectly passive, but to fall upon the enemy in front and flank, even when he is in the act of making an attack upon us. And again, a swift and vigorous assumption of the offensive, the flashing sword of vengeance, is the most brilliant point in the defensive. He who does not at once think of it at the right moment, or rather he who does not from the first include this transition in his idea of the defensive, will never understand its superiority as a form of war. Von Kemmerer comments thus, "And this conception of the defense by Clausewitz has become part and parcel of our army, everywhere, strategically and tactically. He who has been forced into a defensive attitude at once thinks how he can arrange a counterattack. I am thus unable to see how the way in which Clausewitz has contrasted attack and defense could in any way paralyze the spirit of enterprise." Von Kemmerer also justly remarks that, as Clausewitz always insisted both in strategy and tactics, neither attack nor defense is pure, but oscillates between the two forms, and as the attack is frequently temporarily reduced to defend itself, and also as no nation can be sure of never being invaded by a superior coalition, it is most desirable to encourage a belief in the strength of the defense, if properly used. In this, I think that Wellington would probably have agreed. Certainly Austerlitz and Waterloo were examples of battles such as Clausewitz preferred. Still, one must admit that Clausewitz's chapter on the relations of the offensive and defensive to each other in Tactics, Book 8, Chapter 2, is the least convincing chapter of his work. Strategically, the argument is stronger. It always seems to me that we must remember that Clausewitz had taken part in the defensive offensive in its strongest, most absolute and unlimited form, on the greatest possible scale, the Moscow campaign and the ruin, consummated before a single flake of snow fell, of the Grand Army. If he had lived to complete the revision of his works, it always seems to me that he would have made his theory undeniable by stating that the defensive is the strongest form of war, if unlimited by space. What, for instance, would have happened if the Japanese had tried to march through Siberia onto St. Petersburg? But after all, which of the two is absolutely the stronger form of war, attack or defense, is merely a theoretical abstraction, for practically, the choice is always settled for us by the pressing necessity of circumstances. And in this connection, let us always bear in mind Clausewitz's dictum: a swift and vigorous assumption of the offensive, the flashing sword of vengeance, is the most brilliant point in the defensive. The inner line. A second disputed point is Clausewitz's alleged preference, as a rule, for the inner line in strategy. But it is necessary to remember that that was only due to the conditions of his time, before railways and telegraphs, when it was difficult to communicate between columns acting on concentric lines. And he is not in any way wedded to the inner line, like Jomini, but only when circumstances are favorable. He has many sentences from which we may infer that, had he lived in railway and telegraph days, his strategy, like Moltke's, his most distinguished pupil, would have aimed at envelopment as a rule. For to bring up troops rapidly by several railways necessitates a broad strategic front, and Clausewitz especially lays down rapidity as his second great principle, and says, if the concentration of the forces would occasion detours and loss of time, and the danger of advancing by separate lines is not too great, then the same may be justifiable on these grounds, for to effect an unnecessary concentration of the forces would be contrary to the second principle we have laid down, i.e., to act as swiftly as possible. Also, such separation into several columns as is absolutely necessary must be made use of for the disposition of the tactical attack in the enveloping form, for that form is natural to the attack, and must not be disregarded without good reason. Also, it is sufficient now if the concentration takes place during the action. So that while the conditions of his time led Clausewitz to prefer close concentration and the inner line, like Napoleon, yet his reflections led him to propound the germ of the strategy of Moltke. Substitute for Clausewitz's close concentration this: as close concentration, the combined movements regulated by telegraph, as is compatible with the utmost use of the railways and the greatest rapidity, as he would certainly have said, and we arrive at Moltke's strategy. Frontal attacks. A third disputed point is his belief in the superior tactical efficiency, under favorable circumstances, of the Napoleonic method of breaking the enemy's line in the center. Breaking the line by a frontal attack was, of course, much easier in Clausewitz's Napoleonic day than it is with the long-ranging arms of our day, and it is only natural that Clausewitz in his writings should give it the full tactical importance which it then deserved. His book would not be true to the tactical conditions of his day had he not done so, with Rivoli, Austerlitz, Salamanca, Eckmühl, etc., before his mind. But it seems hardly correct to accuse him of over-partiality to frontal attacks, for he has examined both frontal and enveloping attacks most fairly, giving to each their relative advantages and disadvantages, and concluding, the envelopment may lead directly to the destruction of the enemy's army if it is made with very superior numbers and succeeds. If it leads to victory, the early results are in every case greater than by breaking the enemy's line. Breaking the enemy's line can only lead indirectly to the destruction of the enemy's army, and its effects are hardly shown so much on the first day, but rather strategically afterwards, by forcing apart on different lines of retreat the separated fragments of the beaten army. The breaking through the hostile army by massing our principal force against one point supposes an excessive length of front on the part of the enemy, for in this form of attack, the difficulty of occupying the remainder of the enemy's force with few troops is greater, because the enemy's forces nearer to the principal point of attack can easily join in opposing it. Now, in an attack upon the center, there are such forces on both sides of the attack. In an attack upon a flank, only on one side. The consequence of this is that such a central attack may easily end in a very disadvantageous form of combat through a convergent counterattack, which is exactly our modern difficulty. The choice between these two forms of attack must therefore be made according to the existing conditions of the moment: length of front, the nature and direction of the line of retreat, the military qualities of the enemy's troops, and the characteristics of their general. Lastly, the ground must determine the choice. Speaking generally, he regards the concentric enveloping form of tactical attack aiming at the enemy's line of retreat as the most efficacious and natural. On the field of battle itself, the enveloping form must always be considered the most effectual, and the eccentric or frontal counterattack at the extended enveloping attack as the most efficacious and natural form of the defense, such as Napoleon's counterattacks at Austerlitz or Dresden, or Wellington's at Salamanca. And we think that one means is at least as good as the other. Now I think that these extracts sufficiently defend Clausewitz from the imputation of too great a belief in frontal attacks, and considering the frequent success of such Napoleonic attacks in his day, he gives a very fair summing up of the relative advantages and disadvantages thereof, and indeed such as might be written in the present day. Indeed, the quite abnormal conditions of the Boer War produced such a feeling against frontal attacks, and so much loose talk of their being extinct, that it is very useful to turn to Clausewitz for a reminder that breaking the center, whenever the condition he postulates, namely overextension of front on the enemy's part, is present, will always remain one of the two great forms of decisive attack open to a commander. And as in our day, the forces are so enormous that to reach the hostile flank becomes more difficult, and the extension of front becomes so gigantic, a front of several armies on a line of 40 to 70 miles perhaps, it is well to consider whether breaking the enemy's center will not again offer the most advantageous form for the final decisive act, coupled, of course, as Clausewitz says it always must be, with a strong flank attack. And in these gigantic battles of the future, such as Liaoyang and Mukden, which we must consider typical of the future, battles which must take several days, during which the troops in the first line become utterly exhausted and used up, a decisive attack on the center can well be imagined after the hostile reserves have been decoyed away over a day's march by a strong flank attack. As, for example, Nogi's flank attack round Mukden, followed by Nadzu's decisive breaking the center and capture of Mukden itself. So that far from thinking Clausewitz's remarks about frontal attacks and breaking the line to be obsolete, it rather appears from the great Russo-Japanese battles that they are worthy of close study in view of the future. Tactical versus strategical envelopment. A fourth disputed point is the preference of Clausewitz, owing to his insistence on the greatest concentration possible with proper regard for the circumstances, for the tactical envelopment arranged on or near the field to strategical envelopment with divided forces arranged beforehand. In this matter, I will again quote General von Kemmerer, who disagrees with him, and says, Clausewitz proclaims the oblique front as the most effective strategic form of attack. That is to say, when the whole army with one united front falls upon the strategic flank of the enemy, and if victorious, cuts him from his line of retreat. But where such a situation cannot be brought about, where our advance has brought us before the strategic front of the enemy, then he sees in the tactical envelopment, in the formation of an offensive flank, the proper means of effectively preparing to push the enemy from his line of retreat, and he distinctly explains that tactical envelopment need not at all be the consequence of strategical envelopment, and need not at all be prepared long beforehand by a corresponding advance of divided forces. Clausewitz says, "The consequence of this is that battles fought with enveloping lines, or even with an oblique front, which should properly result from an advantageous relation of the lines of communication, are commonly the result of a moral and physical preponderance." Also, he should therefore only advance with his columns on such a width of front as will admit of their all coming into action together. Such separation into several columns should be made use of for the disposition of the tactical attack in the enveloping form, i.e. by troops within a day's march of each other. But it must be only of a tactical nature, for a strategic envelopment, when a great blow is to be struck, is a complete waste of power. General von Kemmerer comments, "He is thus of opinion that the lateral movement of part of the army against the flank of the enemy could without any difficulty still be carried out as initiated by the plan of battle, and in order to understand this idea we must again bear in mind the difference between the fire effect of then and now. In those days, a comparatively short movement made it still possible for a considerable portion of the army to gain the defender's flank. Today, a lengthy and troublesome operation would be necessary for the same object, and its successful execution would only be counted upon if the defender remained entirely passive, and would neither think of a counterstroke nor of a corresponding movement of his forces to the threatened flank." Without going into this controversy, I will, however, quote the excellent reason given by Clausewitz for his preference for tactical as opposed to strategical envelopment. "One peculiarity of the offensive battle is the uncertainty, in most cases, as to the position, note, and strength of the enemy. It is a complete groping about amongst things that are unknown: Austerlitz, Wagram, Hohenlinden, Jena, Katzbach. The more this is the case, the more concentration of forces becomes paramount, and turning a flank to be preferred to surrounding. It is also well to recollect how many famous generals had been ruined in Clausewitz's experience through overextension or dispersion of their forces. The crushing defeats of Napoleon's marshals in the winter of 1813, MacDonald at the Katzbach, Oudinot at Grobieron, Ney at Dennewitz, which neutralized Napoleon's great victory at Dresden and began his ruin, were all chiefly owing to this cause. And the weather may again have as great influence in shortening resistance and allowing troops to be overwhelmed before the too distant reinforcements arrive, as it had in those battles. If the weather then prevented the old muskets going off and enabled the attack to rush the defense, so now a fog, rain, mist, or snow, by restricting the field of view and fire, may produce the same results. When one thinks of the number of great battles fought in such weather, as they may well be again, one sees an additional reason for carefully considering Clausewitz's warning. Far from relegating his preference for the tactical as opposed to the strategical envelopment to the region of the obsolete, because of our improved armament, it seems right to give it full weight as a corrective to a perceivable tendency to elevate strategical envelopment, after Königgrätz, into a formula for victory. If in the past many great generals have been ruined by overextension, so may they be again. Against this tendency, Clausewitz will forever lift his voice. Also, it remains to be considered, with the huge armies of today and the future, such armies as at Liaoyang and Mukden, such armies as may possibly one day join issue in Afghanistan, whether strategical envelopment will be practicable, or whether tactical envelopment, such as General Kuroki's tactical enveloping movement on Yentai and the Russian line of retreat at Liaoyang, or General Nogi's tactical enveloping dash northward on Shinminting and the railway at Mukden, will not be preferable. Perhaps as a compromise, one might call such a movement strategical-tactical, and so avoid the dispute by jugglery of words. I have not attempted to do more than roughly indicate that the solution of these four disputed tactical questions in Clausewitz is to be sought in a study of the latest campaign, as he would have said himself, that is, the campaign in Manchuria. For, as the Times correspondent in the 45th chapter, Clausewitz in Manchuria, of his book The War in the Far East, observes, it will be abundantly clear to anyone who has followed the great battles in Manchuria that the spirit of Clausewitz has presided over Japanese victories and wept over Russian defeats.
Chapter 12. Changes since the days of Clausewitz.
In reading Clausewitz, it is, first, the great principles of the nature of war founded on human nature, which alter not, and secondly, it is his spirit and practical way of looking at things that we want to assimilate and apply to the problems of today, to which end it is necessary to read him always with the changed conditions of today in our minds, and think what he would have said under the circumstances. These changes are chiefly 1. The improved network of roads, 2. Railways, 3. Telegraphs, wire and wireless, 4. Improved arms, 5. Aviation, 6. Universal service armies. The improved network of roads. The improved network of roads in Europe, not, of course, in Manchuria or in Afghanistan, where we have to consider our future strategy, but in Europe, as General von Kemmerer puts it, now offers to the movements of armies everywhere a whole series of useful roads where formerly 1 or 2 only were available. Easier gradients, good bridges instead of unreliable ones, etc. So that the march discipline of that day, when concentrated for battle, artillery and train on the roads, infantry and cavalry by the side of the roads, has disappeared. Such close concentration is therefore now not possible, as we move all arms on the road, and an army corps with train, or 2 without, is the most that we can now calculate on bringing into action in one day on one road. Railways. Railways have, above all, completely altered the term base, remarks von Kemmerer. Railways carry in a few days men, horses, vehicles, and materials of all kinds from the remotest district to any desired point of our country, and nobody would any longer think of accumulating enormous supplies of all kinds at certain fortified points on his own frontier, with the object of basing himself on those points. One does not base oneself any longer on a distinct district which is specially prepared for that object, but upon the whole country, which has become one single magazine with separate storerooms. So the term base has now to be considered in this light. It is only when operating in savage or semi-savage countries, where there are no railways, that the old idea of a base applies. As we penetrate deeper and further from our own country into the enemy's, and as a small raiding party can demolish the railway line so as to stop all traffic for days or weeks, it becomes far more necessary than it ever was in Clausewitz's day to guard our communications. And armies become more and more sensitive to any attack upon their communications. Also, such a line cannot easily be changed, and consequently those celebrated changes of the line of communication in an enemy's country which Napoleon himself on some occasion declared to be the ablest maneuver in the art of war could scarcely be carried out any more. Von Kemmerer. Also, concentration by means of several railways demands a broad strategic front, which produces that separation of corps or armies which prepares the way for strategical envelopment, and so on. General von der Goltz, in his Conduct of War, says, "The more recent treatises on the conduct of war on a large scale are principally taken up with the mobilization and strategical concentration of armies, a department of strategy which only began to play an important part in modern times. It is the result of a dense network of railways in Western Europe, which has rendered it possible to mass large bodies of troops in a surprisingly brief time. Each power tries to outdo its neighbors in this respect, which gives an opportunity to the strategical specialist to show off his brilliant qualities. Consequently, it is now frequently assumed that the whole conduct of war is comprised in this one section of it. This overestimate is of course an error, which, however, requires to be pointed out. Telegraphs. The telegraph has very greatly reduced the danger of separation. The great advantage of the inner line in the day of Napoleon and of Clausewitz was that separated forces could only communicate by mounted messengers, so if the enemy got between them, they could not communicate at all, nor act in concert. This the telegraph has completely altered, for as the field telegraph can now be laid as quickly as an army can advance, the most widely separated bodies of troops can every day arrange combined operations by telegraph through, if necessary, a point 100 or 400 miles in rear. So that today the chief advantage of the inner line has gone, while its chief disadvantage, the possibility of being surrounded, remains. Maps. We now possess complete detailed ordnance maps of every country in Europe, kept up to date by the latest alterations, whereas in the days of Clausewitz maps were of the very roughest character and quite unreliable in comparison. Improved arms, smokeless powder, quick-firing and long-ranging artillery and rifles, the infantry field of effective fire being 10 times, the artillery 5 times what it was in Clausewitz's time, have all to be borne in mind when reading the tactical part of his writings. In consequence, also, cover and the tactical use of ground are of far greater importance now than then, etc., etc., etc. Aviation. The recent wonderful developments in aviation will obviously almost revolutionize information in war. To what extent, it is as yet impossible to say. Each year will teach us more. The nation in arms. The nation in arms as the common foundation of all armies, except our own, brought up by railways, vastly increases the numbers in a modern battle from what they were in Clausewitz's day. Compare Austerlitz, Dresden, Leipzig, and Waterloo with Liaoyang and Mukden. It should be so with us also, for as General von der Goltz says in The Conduct of War, the best military organization is that which renders available all the intellectual and material resources of the country in event of war. A state is not justified in trying to defend itself with only a portion of its strength when the existence of the whole is at stake. In Great Britain, the difference which the introduction of this nation in arms principle has made in our military strength compared with that of our future opponents, a difference relatively far greater against us than it was in Napoleon's and Clausewitz's day, is as yet hardly realized by the people or by our statesmen. People forget the wastage of war and the necessity for a constant flow of troops to repair that wastage. As von der Goltz puts it, it is characteristic of the strategical offensive that the foremost body of troops of an army, the portion which fights the battles, amounts to only a comparatively small fraction, frequently only a quarter or even 1/8 of the total fighting strength employed, whilst the fate of the whole army throughout depends upon the success or failure of this fraction. Attacking armies melt away like snow in the spring. To condense his remarks, in spite of the most admirable discipline, the Prussian Guard Corps lost 5,000 to 6,000 men in the marches between the attack on Saint Privat and the Battle of Sedan. Napoleon crossed the Niemen in 1812 with 442,000 men, but reached Moscow only 3 months later with only 95,000. In the spring of 1810, the French crossed the Pyrenees with 400,000 men. But still, Marshal Massena in the end only brought 45,000 men up to the lines of Torres Vedras, near Lisbon, where the decision lay. Again, in 1829, the Russians put 160,000 men in the field, but had barely 20,000 left when, at Adrianople, a skillfully concluded peace saved them before their weakness became apparent and a reaction set in. In 1878, the Russians led 460,000 across the Danube, but they only brought 100,000 men, of whom only 43,000 were effective, the rest being sick, to the gates of Constantinople. In 1870, the Germans crossed the French frontier with 372,000 men, but after only a 6 weeks campaign, brought but 171,000 men to Paris, and so on. The result of it all is simple, that a people which is not based on the modern principle of the nation in arms cannot for long rival or contend with one that is, for it can neither put an equal, still less a superior army into the field at the outset, vide Clausewitz's first principle, nor even maintain in the field the inferior army it does place there, because it cannot send the ever-required fresh supplies of trained troops. Sooner or later this must tell. Sooner or later a situation must arise in which the nation based on the obsolete voluntary system must go down before a nation based on the nation in arms principle. Circumstances change with time, and as wise Lord Bacon said long ago, he that will not adopt new remedies must expect new evils. May we adopt the remedy before we experience the evil. The moral and spiritual forces in war. But though these changed conditions must, of course, modify Clausewitz's details in many important particulars, still, to complete our circle and leave off where we started, I repeat that, as human nature never changes, and as the moral is to the physical as 3 to 1 in war, Clausewitz, as the great realistic and practical philosopher on the actual nature of war, as the chief exponent of the moral and spiritual forces in war, will ever remain invaluable in the study of war. Consider what unsurpassed opportunities he had for observing and reflecting on the influence of enthusiasm and passion, of resolution and boldness, of vacillation and weakness, of coolness and caution, of endurance and hardship, of patriotism and freedom, of ambition and of glory. On war, either by his own experience or by conversation with other equally experienced soldiers, during that long period of almost endless wars between 1793 and 1815. The fervor and enthusiasm and boundless energy of the Revolution, which drove the French forward, smashing everything before them at the beginning, the ambition, military glory, plunder, and greed which animated them later on, the patriotism, religious and loyal devotion, and stern endurance, which nerved the Russian hosts then as now. That awful Moscow winter campaign, when human nature rose to its highest and sank to its lowest, when the extremes of heroic endurance and selfish callousness were visible side by side, the magnificent uprising of the spirit of liberty and freedom from intolerable oppression in Germany, which gave to the Prussian recruits and Landwehr the same driving force that revolutionary enthusiasm had formerly given to the French. The passing, therefore, in 1813 of the moral superiority, the greater driving force, from the French to the Allies. Clausewitz saw all this. He conversed intimately with such men as Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, who saw and guided it too. All his friends had seen it also. No wonder, then, that such an unexampled series of warlike phenomena deeply impressed his reflective mind with the supreme importance of the moral and spiritual factors in war. His opportunities for long-continued observation of warlike phenomena were far greater than those of any writer since his day, and it is to be hoped they will remain so. For we have no desire to see another series of wars such as the Napoleonic. It is fortunate for us that there was then such a man as Clausewitz to sum up for us so simply and so clearly the accumulated experiences of those long, long years of carnage and devastation.
This concludes the final chapter of The Reality of War by Stewart Murray, presented by Major Intonio. If you want to download the complete audiobook, visit our web shop at www.payhip.com/Intonio. Thank you for listening, and so long.